We are, of course, seeing a spike in cases in America. We're seeing a spike in cases around many parts of the world, and of course, a spike in Scotland, where, of course, kids went back to school in August. In England, kids going back to school in the next few days across England and Wales, and we are likely to see a spike then. I have no doubt at all that we will be seeing the usual demands as we expect whenever cases go up, that we must have more and more restrictions on our lives. National Education Union this morning has talked about, in the papers this morning, has reported as saying, that the government is basically making a wrong decision by letting schools go back without bubbles, without masks, and inevitably we're going to see all these cases explode. And who knows, we may end up in a situation as we're seeing in America, where Dr. Anthony Fauci, who leads the medical side of the response there, endorsing vaccine passports for children at secondary school. What do you make of it all?
It's very worrying because, what's more worrying to me now is not so much the spikes in COVID, although, of course, we should keep an eye on all of that, but the response. And I think we live in societies that respond irrationally to all cases of COVID. And there are going to be more arguments for lockdown. There are going to be arguments for even more extreme measures like vaccinating children without parental consent. That's what some people are talking about. All of these things to me are red lines. We are crossing red lines into an authoritarian society in which parents wouldn't even have control over their own kids potentially. So we've got to be very wary of all of this. The key point I would make is that we've got to learn to live with COVID-19.
Well, they keep telling us that, and then we're only allowed to do it for a few weeks at a time. I mean, if you think about, say, the parental consent for the vaccines. I mean, a vaccine for young people. If it was incontrovertibly clear that children benefited from these vaccines, they'd have been rolled out to us already. I know it's happened in a number of different countries, but one of the reasons why we don't have the French deciding our vaccine policy is because we want the British authorities and our medics to look at it. But we don't even require children to have MMR. When those are killer diseases for children, whereas COVID undoubtedly is not. The average healthy normal child who gets COVID is barely affected by it.
That's right. And, I'm very pro-vaccination. I've been double vaxxed. I've been encouraging everyone I know to get vaxxed.
Absolutely.
It's a good thing. But with children, we do have to talk about what's riskier, them catching COVID-19 or them being vaccinated. With adults, it's pretty clear. If you get COVID-19, you're at higher risk of illness than if you get vaccinated. Very clear. But with children, it's a different story. They don't get ill from COVID at all. What I'm worried about is vaccination fatigue. As you say, there are some vaccines that children receive which are incredibly important, like MMR. I'm worried that we will now have this vaccination fatigue where young people and adults will think, God, we're being vaccinated all the time. Why bother? And if young people don't get MMR vaccine, then that is a real problem. So we have to be careful about what kind of vaccines we push on children in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm particularly concerned that we're not going to allow kids to have that long of a normal life. I'm delighted, as I mentioned earlier, my daughter's head teacher wrote and said, we're going back. There won't be any bubbles. Children. I mean, my child is going to be in year 10. She's going to be allowed to talk to someone in year 9 or year 11. How amazing. How exciting. They're not be allowed to do that for the last year, banned from having any time with them in school, having to eat lunch separately in their bubbles and the like, wearing masks in the corridor for much of that time and quite a lot of that time in the classroom as well. Is it your fear? Do you share the same fear as I have that as soon as case rates go up, as inevitably they will, when you test millions more people and when people are going back into their homes because the weather's miserable in September and October, we will see case rates go up? We may see a new variant. Who knows? But that we will return to exactly the same policies again that are still completely and utterly unproven to achieve anything. We saw what's happened in Sweden. We've seen what happened in places like Florida and Texas, where they go up and then they plateau and then they go down without any of these measures at all. And yet we're going to do it all again.
That's really what worries me at the moment. Boris said there won't be a lockdown again. I'm not so sure about that. No. And there will be lots of voices clamoring for one. The experts who love lockdown, the ones who said that Freedom Day would lead to complete disaster, which never actually happened. Those kinds of people will be fighting hard for another lockdown in winter when cases inevitably go up. And we have to resist that because we can't suspend the whole of life in response to one virus, especially a virus that we have tamed with vaccination, and we've managed to turn it into something that is pretty mild. We can't lock down in response to something like that any more than we would lock down in response to flu, which comes around every winter.
Oh,
as well.
I just worry they're going to use the same arguments for flu. We are going to be seeing a rise in respiratory diseases. Who knows? We'll have a very bad flu winter, and the same excuses will be used. The main issue here right now is I want categoric. We will never lock down again. We will never close the schools again. We will never have a mask mandate again. We will never force businesses to close. That will never happen again. So if you are at risk, you need to take extra precautions when cases are high. And we will make sure that our hospitals have enough staff, enough equipment, enough places that they can function, as opposed to constantly. I mean, for how many years are we going to use the NHS might not cope as an excuse for shutting down the rest of society?
That's the thing that's been most shocking over the past 18 months or 2 years. This idea that the NHS, we have to all suspend life and the economy and the future to save the NHS. I thought the NHS was supposed to serve us. The thing is that if the NHS can't cope with these kinds of explosions of virus, then we need to expand it and make it more elastic. Like, the fire service, for example, lots of firefighters sit around during the day. They don't do work every day in the same way that other people do, but they are there because they are absolutely essential to society, and society needs them. We need to think about the NHS in the same way, make it have greater elasticity so that it can cope with viruses like this, and the rest of us don't have to give up our life and our freedom to save the NHS.
And indeed, if you look at the statistics, what's happening now, we've got a very high caseload at the current time, but we haven't got the same high hospitalisation, so we haven't got the same deaths. Most of the caseload is in teens and people in their 20s who are going to be very, very, largely unaffected by this. And again, I do find it frustrating when people say, I know a 24-year-old, there was a young lad in the papers, a 24-year-old who died. I'm absolutely gutted for him and his family. It's terrible. It's a tragedy. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. Wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. But when you saw the pictures, he must have been 10 stone overweight. And a parent saying, I'm really worried about the health of my child. Well, don't feed your child into oblivion then, and push them into an early grave by doing that. We need to have a wake-up call about what the risks are. And understand that, if you look at the stats now, even, up to 60 years old, you are healthy people up to that age group are really very, very, very incredibly unlikely to be seriously ill, hospitalized or die from this disease. And we've really got to get it in perspective. When we see those death tolls every single day on the government dashboard, we need to stop focusing on that, or at the very least, if we're going to say how many people have died with COVID, can we have all the other deaths from all the other things as well?
Well, that's the thing, the problem with the blanket approach of lockdown, where everyone gets locked down regardless of your risk. The problem with that is that it didn't give us any room to talk about who's really at risk from this virus. And instead, lots of the media coverage early on, at least, was this idea that anyone could drop dead from COVID-19, which just wasn't true. We know that it impacted on elderly people more. We know that there were underlying conditions. Those are the kinds of things we should have been talking about, and which we still should be talking about. We need to know what kind of people this virus is hitting so that we can suggest that they take certain measures when winter comes.
Not to say their lives aren't worth living or keeping,
absolutely
of course,
not.
But just these are the people who need to take precautions. And, maybe I would suggest it's a good idea that when your kids go back to school, they don't spend lots of time with their grandparents for the first few weeks. Unless having them tested beforehand or something. That would seem to me to be a sensible measure.
Sensible steps that ordinary people can take using their own common sense. That's what we need. And that's what most people will do that when winter comes around and the spike goes up. But it's precisely because we value the lives of people with underlying conditions and people who are older. It's precisely because their lives are so valuable that we should talk about the risks that they face, and we should talk about what society can do to assist them without destroying its own future. Exactly. So we've got to think about all people, and the lockdown fanatics with their blanket approach, they've messed up life both for fit people and also for unwell people too, and that kind of unclear focus didn't help anyone.
When we're not focusing on those people, can I also ask, you're talking about bringing back sanity. We won't do Extinction Rebellion. I don't think my nerves can cope with it. But a Canadian TV series, Paw Patrol, which I'm delighted I've never had to see, but it's a very, very big children's show, which basically has 6 dogs representing the different emergency services as the main characters. The key character is Chase, a German Shepherd police dog. It's been criticised by the usual lunatics on social media, saying that this basically is propaganda glorifying the police. and it's come under fire for indoctrinating children with a pro-police stance. That's what woke activists online are saying. Your thoughts, Brendan?
I mean, just when you thought wokeness couldn't get any more crazy, they're now attacking Paw Patrol, this cartoon that is actually, I've actually watched Paw Patrol because one of my nieces loves it. So I've seen some of it. It's good fun. The idea that it is pro-police propaganda is just psychotic.
It's a cartoon.
Yeah, it's a cartoon. And what makes me laugh about some of these woke activists is that they're more than happy to push propaganda into children's faces when it comes to teaching about transgender ideology in school, for example, or gender fluidity or other critical race theory. They want to push that down children's throats all the time. But when it comes to a cartoon that just happens to feature a cop, they go mad. So it's an extraordinary double standard, and they really need to calm down. It's a cartoon.
What, woke people having double standards? Goodness me, I'm shocked, Brendan. I'm shocked.